We are so fortunate. Well, you can see they're so fortunate. You guys have really brought out the crowd. I mean, how many times in your life can you get award-winning journalists and they're your friends on top of it? We've had all sorts of awards being awarded to them, Pulitzer Prize, and every other kind of an award that exists. They all have either been nominated or won it all. And thank you for doing that. So, let me start. I want to welcome you all to this season. I'm so glad you're here about the America media's future. Rarely in the United U.S. history has there been a greater need for quality, objectivity, fact-based news, and yet the media itself is struggling with huge international internal challenges and a lot of criticism from both the right and the left. To discuss this topic, we have three prominent members of the media, all originally from the New York Times. Judy is now here with Fox News, and Jerry still writes, not only for New York Times, for other places. Yeah. And Alex, are you writing for the New York Times anymore?
Not for the Times. Not for the Times.
Okay. He's the Pulitzer Prize winning journalist who comes from a journalistic family. They owned newspapers.
In Tennessee.
In Tennessee. And he saw the demise of what was going on in the newspaper industry. And he won a prize about it too. And he also taught at Harvard on the policy of journalism. I'll let him describe what he does better than I am, but I'm so happy you came. You're the moderator today? Yeah, they brought the moderator. Okay. Judy Miller is a resident here. You all know her. You know she's famous, a very famous reporter. She now is the editor of Manhattan Institute City Journal and a Fox News commentator. She investigated Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda, which the paper published 9 months before 9/11. And you know about her deciding to write about Iraq and weapons of mass destruction, which she was given by a security intelligence person. And it turned out that it caused a lot of problems, and she said, I am not going to reveal my sources because that is a confidentiality, or you can never be a journalist, no one would tell you a thing. So she went to jail. And guess what? We have her lawyer who got her out of jail, Bob Bennett, right here. Isn't it fun being in Palm Beach? You don't know who's here. I love it. Okay. And she has written many books, and they're in the back. And she wrote her own story about what really happened, and you may wish to buy it. But the middle one is my dear friend, Geraldine Fabrikant, who comes and stays with me all the time, and I love her, and organizes me and orders me around. And so Jerry covered the entertainment industry for the New York Times for over 20 years. During the time, she was in a group who was involved in the financial reporting, and they got nominated for a Pulitzer. She has numerous awards. She continues to write for the New York Times and other publications. And she's here with her husband, Tim Metz, who is the the editor of the Wall Street Journal. And he's hiding. Are you hiding from your wife, or are you hiding from me? Anyway, I welcome you. Now, you know we're an interactive group. I expect all of you, if you have an opinion, or a question, but I'm asking you just keep it short, all right? Because no one wants to sit there, but we are very interested in your ideas, very much so. John Firestone, wherever you are here, has just written an article for the Washington Post, and I'm excited. He shared it with us because it's a great idea, and I'm going to have you say what it is. And then he published it, and that means any of you can write. Okay, who's doing it?
Well, thank you, Dale, and thank you to the Couder Foundation or Institute. Is that it? This has been a wonderful place to be at this time. I was talking to a friend of mine in Boston this morning, and he offered to come down and help me with a business problem immediately. It's not good weather up there. As Dale said, I'm from a small town newspaper background. My family got into the newspaper business in 1916 when my grandmother, who had a husband who, as she delicately put it, had a weakness for John Barleycorn, in his cups one day bought the smallest of 3 weekly newspapers in this little town. And the prospects of this newspaper were not great. In a heavily Republican area, this newspaper was called the Greenville Democrat. And she knew that wasn't going to work out. And eventually, she had to take it over. In October of 1916, she told me this story many times. She put on her hat and went down and took over this newspaper, knowing nothing about it. And a rival newspaper in the town that week published an item that said, "A woman has become proprietor of the Greenville Democrat." This is in October of 1916. He said, "This newspaper will not be alive when the roses bloom." She could quote it verbatim many years later. And then she would add, 3 years later, I owned both the other newspapers. And though I'd heard this story many times, it was my part always to say, why had you owned both the other newspapers? And she'd give me this very fixed look and say, because they were drunk and I was sober. Well, my family has been in the newspaper business all that time since. And the newspaper business was a good business to be in because it had an economic model that worked very well. It meant that you could sell advertising to a community, and the advertising revenue could be used to hire reporters, and that there was enough money from advertising and subscriptions that the newspaper could function as most newspapers in most communities did, as an institution that was very much critical to the well-being and the success of the community. That now has changed, as you all know. The economic model collapsed. Advertising does not now support newspapers sufficient to be able for them to put on the kind of news muscle that is necessary to do the job. That's what we're here to talk about the state of journalism, which is rooted, frankly, in my opinion anyway, deeply in the problem of newspapers, because newspapers have always been, in this country anyway, the engine of generating news, of producing news, of creating news. Well, my colleagues here today are, as Dale said, superb journalists. We were all together at the New York Times at the same time. And we want to talk to you about the future of news and the state of news today. And we want to start with the role of the Ukraine invasion. We wanted to do something that was not just beating the dead horse of the media again and again, as you've all heard. We wanted to sort of bring it current. And we thought that looking at how this momentous event has changed or affected the media would be a good place to start. Judy, I'd like to ask you to give your view of how that has affected journalism.
Thank you, Alex, and thank you all for being here.
Are you mic'd right?
Yes, I think I am. Can you all hear me? In the back, yes. I think microphones and I are now, after 8 years at Fox News, pretty familiar with each other. Look, Ukraine, we would not know anything about what's happening in Ukraine were it not for newspapers, largely newspapers today. And I think what Ukraine has meant for our industry is that it's highlighted the role and the importance of the existence of newspapers and also television in an era where everyone talks about globalization, but it's actually harder and harder in many instances to get factual-based news about what's happening in a place. It's highlighted the importance of independent reporters, of people who are willing to put themselves in harm's way. And I speak as someone who, at Fox News, we have now lost 2 staff members in Ukraine, and we have a third, a young, brilliant reporter with 3 small children who was in the hospital back in the United States after being gotten out of Ukraine. Fox News alone has more than 5 people in Ukraine bringing you the news. The New York Times has, I think, the last time I counted, at least 8 people who are rotating, going back and forth, who are putting themselves in harm's way to bring you the news. And I think too often, as we complain about various aspects of news coverage or alleged bias, we forget that the people who bring you the news often do so at great sacrifice. But if anything, if there is a silver lining to this horror unfolding in Ukraine, it's to highlight the importance of the international press and our own newspapers in particular.
Jerry is on the board of one of the most important organizations protecting journalists, the Committee to Protect Journalists. And I know that is something that you feel very strongly about, Jerry.
Well, yes, I am, and it's a very active board, and since the Ukraine happened, we've been called on to raise as much money as possible and do as much as we can to get journalists out of the Ukraine or to help those who are there who don't want to leave. The thing that's so particularly interesting about this is that was our mandate. Our mandate when we started was to help reporters around the world who didn't have access to a legal system that could protect them, get the money and the resources and the lawyers and wherever in the world they needed help. What's interesting now is we're having to do the same thing in the U.S. because of what's happened to the U.S. press. So while the demands from the Ukraine are enormous, we're having to meet demands from all over the world as countries have thought, as Putin did, that they could simply crack down on the press without any repercussions.
You know, one of the things that the word I used when I was speaking originally was institutions, that these newspapers, news organizations are institutions of great importance to a community. And what is being lost along with the news is the power of these institutions to call attention and to make things public in an effective way that will change things for the better. Let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. I was the director of the Shorenstein Center on Media Politics and Public Policy at Harvard for 15 years. And when I first came there in 2001, I remember opening my front door and there was the Boston Globe on a Sunday. And it had what we in the business call a, how can I put this any other way, an holy shit front page. It was about the Catholic Church in that diocese protecting predatory, clergy for years. Now, the thing is that the Catholic Church in that day's Boston Globe, which was a huge thing, its only role was to say no comment. And what had happened is that a couple of months before, the locally sort of alternative newspaper in Boston had printed a fair amount of the same material, which was based on legal documents and testimony. But the Catholic Church, again, in that case, had said no comment, and nothing had happened. Nothing had happened. But because this was reported by the institutional Boston Globe, which is like as important to Boston as the Red Sox and the Patriots, at least I used to be, that the Catholic Church could not stand mute. And you know, in the years since, how that has unfolded. That began with a report in the Boston Globe that the Catholic Church had been able to ignore from another lesser institution. Now, what this means, I think, for news media and communities like Palm Beach is that the local newspaper may not be able to have the muzzle velocity in its reporting to be able to make a difference. Most people, based on polling that I've seen, they may be very critical of the media, but they want somebody, some organizations, some institution, if you will, to be watching the store. They don't want to leave it to politicians to operate out of view. Judy, the watchdog role, in my experience, is something you have made a specialty of. How do you sort of look at that role as it's unfolding in the environment we're in now?
Well, I think it's under attack because when you watch the dog and you criticize the dog, there are many people who are friends of the dog and they are extremely upset by what you write. And so they not only defend the dog, but they attack you. And as a result, something I never thought I would see in this country, you have had reporters and editors being threatened physically, their families physically threatened, their children harassed at school, their addresses and telephone numbers published on the internet, their friends encouraged to go make their displeasure with what these watchdogs have written and said. This is from small, affects reporters at small papers and even at large institutions. And I think I've been especially critical of our own profession, and I've not hesitated to write about it. But the only time I've had to worry about my personal safety has been overseas covering a war. And now, for the first time, reporters have to be really worried about reporting the truth or what they purport to be the truth here at home. So, yes.
Well, the Committee to Protect Journalists has training programs now for American journalists to go to demonstrations or go to picket lines to protect themselves in case anything happens to them. And I have to say, I've been on the board for 20 years. The idea that we have to think about that in this country is actually a moment to ask ourselves how safe democracy is if that's what's going on.
Jerry was a business reporter at the New York Times. Her area of her field was the entertainment industry. And she has written really, about business for a long, long time. Now, there is another element that makes business reporting even more difficult. And one of Jerry's great friends is one of the premier investigative business reporters in the United States. Talk about that, Jerry.
Well, I don't know if
You got to hold it.
if I should say who it is. Gretchen Morgensen is working on a book now about private equity, and she was telling me yesterday that what's happened now is if you take on a company, while you're working on the story, they hire lawyers to call you and threaten you before the story is published. They start harassing you on the phone. They hire armies of public relations people. Now, we've all dealt with public relations people, but not armies of them. There are trolls. They'll call you at home and threaten you. She said the atmosphere has become so hostile that it really takes reporting to a new level. And she said one of the bizarre things that, in her view, has happened, as little papers around the country are forced to close, reporters need jobs, so they become they get into these armies of PR people that then start calling you to harass you, and it makes the job much more difficult. And it also suggests that unless you're working for a major institution that can protect you in the sense of, I'm not saying that you're right, but at least defend you if this comes up, you're not going to write those stories because you can't, because your institution can't run the risk of a lawsuit it can't afford to fight.
There's something else too, which is the impact of what happens when newspapers close in communities like ours. There are now officially about 300 what we call news deserts, and that is across our country, which is or communities without a single source of independent news at all. And as a result of their absence, this phenomenon has been studied. Basically about not only do local taxes go up because nobody's watching who's getting contracts to perform municipal services, but the wages of people being in local government have gone up by an average of $1.4 million a year in these communities. Participation in local elections is way, way down in communities without a local newspaper. There are, and individual taxpayers pay $85 more per capita in communities without local newspapers. So these are all, I think, impacts of the existence of a press, no matter how much we annoy you, that I don't think is fully understood by a lot of people in this country.
You know, the truth, of course, is that this is also a very, critical moment for journalism in the most literal sense. In other words, a lot of you, I have no doubt, are very critical of the way news organizations, some news organizations anyway, do their job. That you find bias in the news, that you find the news not to your liking, and that you have criticisms. We're going to be opening this up to questions shortly, so we would welcome your thoughts and your attitudes. But I want to again emphasize what Judy said. The critical thing is not that we all agree with each other, it seems to me, but that we can find some basis for believing what we hear and read, and some of us look one place for that and some of us look another. The solution to this, as far as I'm concerned, is to have a broad, area of news gathering in your daily diet. If you don't like the New York Times, you've got Fox, but if you don't like Fox, you've also got the New York Times, but you need not to ignore either one. It's a kind of education process. Unfortunately, the reality is also, and I covered the media, that was my beat at the New York Times, the media. There's a kind of fantasy about news and people's interest in news. People really, in general, are not very interested in news. They're interested in news that affects them. They're interested in news that has especially some direct impact on their lives. But if you look at newspapers, even in their best days, most of the advertising was in the sports section and in this features section, the cooking section, the fashion section, because that's where the advertisers wanted to be, because that's where people's attention was. The front page, the A section, not as much advertising, because that was not really what people were interested in. But the problem now is that if we don't support the creation and reporting of that kind of news that will not be able to be sustained by advertising, it's going to go away. I think the thing that we have been talking about amongst ourselves is, well, what's to be done? What's the future? What is the future of this news? I certainly believe, I don't know that Jerry and Judy would see it quite the same way, but I think in general they understand what I'm talking about. I believe we're going to have to find a way for people who are interested in news, which is a small number of people, even in Palm Beach. They're going to have to be able to support good news locally and do it on the basis of something like NPR and be able to take a tax deduction from it. But they would have a vehicle then for satisfying their need, their citizens' need for news. That's not going to be everybody. Most people, as I say, they want the comics, they want the sports and whatnot. But there is a democratic need for that kind of news, and we do have to find a way to make it economically sustainable. Judy, what do you think?
I agree, and I think the three of us are pretty pessimistic about the future of the business, because news is a business. Even when I look around at the number of papers, when I was writing a chapter in a book on this, and Alex has also written an entire book on it, but we used to have 9,000 newspapers in this country that went down in the past decade to 7,000, and the projection is within 36 months, half of those will not exist. 25
that's a catastrophe as far as I'm
25 of our largest newspaper chains used to own 20% of newspapers. They now own more than a third. Newspapers, the survivors, are being taken over by hedge funds that basically rape the papers, fire the reporters, sell the buildings, and then cash out and close the papers. That's happening too, all over the country. And Alex was talking about one model for countering this. There are very few alternatives. You can have a wealthy individual, be he of left or right, who wants to finance a paper, like Jeff Bezos has done at the Washington Post or the Los Angeles Times, which has been bought by an individual. You can have groups like in New Jersey. Governor Phil Murphy helped put together a citizens investigative fund to support local newspapers and investigative projects, about $100 million worth of public federal money. But basically these models are not sustainable. And that means we're going to have less and less news, and I think that means we're going to be dumber and dumber as a republic. And that worries me a great deal.
Decline in the quality of education.
So, this is a problem that we've identified without obvious solutions. And you can, some people say, well, television is the answer. But it's not really. In a recent survey that was done in LA, local government, which is so important to all of us wherever we are, received 33 seconds out of a 30-minute broadcast on average. And crime received 22% of the on-air time. Television simply cannot replace newspapers as a source of detailed, authoritative news, try as we may. And finally, one last thing that I noticed is that we have gone from what I call the New York Times model of all the news fit to print to adopting a kind of European model in which newspapers increasingly adopt the politics or political drift of its owners and its reporters. And as a result, if you pick up the New York Times, you know you're going to get a kind of liberal slant on a lot of the news. And if you open the Wall Street Journal, you will get a more conservative slant. That is not a bad model, it's just a different model of news from what traditionally has been the American approach to the news media.
Also, I think that I'm speaking because I'm looking around and seeing a lot of women in the audience, and part of the women's movement has been enormously helped by the power of the press. And I'll give you an example. Many years ago, I wrote stories about Sherry Lansing, who was the first head of a movie studio. And the guys at the other studios, they weren't so thrilled, and then she started to do really well, and they were really not thrilled. And then, as time went on, they started having to appoint other women because there was this pressure. And other papers were writing about Sherry as well. And one head of a rival studio was about to name an assistant, she was being promoted from assistant to director, whatever. And he said to me, well, what was I gonna do? You all have been writing about women for so goddamn long, I have to do something. But it was that national voice and that national statement and endorsement that really made a difference and in general has helped women, I think, move ahead in this country?
I think that with that, I think that we'll open it up to your questions. Is there someone who's going to be able to hand a microphone out there or anything like that, or you maybe just have to stand up and speak loudly? Yes, sir.
I have 2 questions.
That's all right. No, she's got a question. Debbie's got it.
I have 2 questions for the panel. The first is an easy question that I mentioned to Judy earlier. In the media in the last day or 2, all they're doing is talking about that Putin doesn't know what's going on and he's not hearing anything. And I cannot believe that Putin doesn't have access to US and European television, and that his curiosity hasn't allowed him to look at it, even though his generals may not be saying anything. The second question really goes to what you, Geraldine, and Judy were talking about a minute ago, and that is the problems with the liberals on one side, the conservatives on the other side, and very frankly, should you blame the media for creating such a terrible diversification that's going on in this country today? Because it has to stop. I mean, it's getting to blow everything apart.
Judy, you want to answer that?
Well, I'll take a stab at it. I wrote a piece for Fox News earlier when we began to hear the Putin crazy theme. Oh, he's nuts. Look at him. He's taking steroids. He's done, all on the basis of nothing. No one knows what is inside Vladimir Putin's head. But it is impossible for me to believe that he does not know what's going on, whether or not his generals are lying to him, which of course they are, because you always lie to the dictator because they only want good news. But Putin, in my view, and I have not interviewed him, one of the few leaders I have not interviewed, but I don't have to look into his eyes either and to see whether or not he has a soul. I just think he's not crazy. He has done this before. He has spelled out exactly what he's going to do, and he has proceeded to do it. And that's not crazy as far as I'm concerned. So I also think he's both fairly well informed, not crazy, and I think a lot of the meme that started Crazy Putin actually, in a way, deflects attention and diverts attention from what we should be looking at, which is what he is systematically doing.
Right. Also, I think Roger Cohn wrote a really excellent piece in the New York Times on the front page, 4 pages long, making exactly that point, that this is true to form, it's the outgrowth of everything he's done previously, and to think he's out of touch, or there's too much evidence that
So
points
why
to
does
the past.
why does the media keep saying that he doesn't know what's going on?
No,
The media doesn't say it. Some people may say it, and they may be, there somewhere. But what media says it?
Every morning I was listening to Fox, I was listening to CNN, I was listening to MSNBC.
And they say he doesn't know what he's doing?
Headlines.
Well,
That's the evidence.
I think that you use your own judgment and you say, that's bullshit. But that's what you have to do. I mean, honestly, I think the question that you also asked about the polarization and the bias, that's why I think you need to spread your news, your news appetite broadly. You need to look at different people and different sources for news and find ones that you feel like not only agree with you, but don't agree with you. And see what you can sort of parse out. Because ultimately, that's what you have to do anyway. You're not going to be slaves to Walter Cronkite. We weren't then. We aren't now. But I think that what happens is that in time, truth will out. It's like, for instance, when we went into, when we invaded Iraq, there was, a lot of controversy about that, but there was not a lot of press coverage because journalists couldn't get in. We couldn't get in. So we were dependent, like Judy was, about people who were telling us what the truth was, but there was no way to find out. We go in, and along with the soldiers went journalists. And when we got in, we did what journalists do. They started reporting. And it didn't make the White House happy because what we were reporting was not what they had been telling people. And I think that that is the point. You have to sort of give it a little time for the truth to come out. But I don't think, it strikes me that anyone who thinks Putin doesn't know what he's doing is delusional. He's doing exactly what he wants to do. Now, I think he's made a colossal mistake based on his own self-interest. But I don't think that because a newspaper or any news organization says something dumb that, you don't have to buy it.
Because the newspapers are
They're all
just,
saying something dumb. I hate to.
No, they're not all saying it.
Ask the other people in the room.
We can point
Well,
to.
we got to get some more people here.
Can I just answer one thing on whether or not the media has created the polarization? I don't think so. I think the media have exaggerated and intensified the polarization by reporting the polarization. And I think that to blame us for the divisions within the country is really not fair or accurate.
We have another mic here. This, by the way, is a member of the Pulitzer family, so pay attention.
So I actually have a question on the future of journalism, which we've talked about, and the word newspaper has been used a lot, and it's a quaint word, if not antiquated at this point. And then there is TV, which costs a lot of money. So in this room, I'm sure that newspaper and TV is a possibility, but there's generations that aren't racing off to buy newspapers because that's not part of their world. And they can't afford internet, they can't afford Xfinity, they can't afford that kind of thing. So I think that journalism, where is it going to respond to the crisis that we have, certainly of my children and the children that are younger? Because newspapers aren't the answer and Xfinity is too expensive.
Well, I think I want to address this. I wrote about this in this book that I wrote called Losing the News. You can't confuse news organizations that report with where you get your news. The thing that newspapers did is what Judy was saying. The newspapers were the engines of doing the reporting that was then put on television, put online, and so forth. But somebody had to do that initial reporting, and mostly that was newspapers that did it. That's what's going away. That's why the news content is being eroded. Now, younger generation, I think, are generally less interested in news. They're, of course, looking at their devices all the time. But what news they do get, almost certainly comes from the news media, news organizations that have put reporters in the field and are increasingly, especially on a local level, less likely to be able to afford to do that. But that's where the news came from.
Can I address the social media? More and more people are getting their news from social media. Facebook, that seems to be, quote, the future. But as Alex was saying, it can't be, it's not. Because those organizations are into profits. They're not into spending $1 million a year, which is roughly what it costs to put a reporter overseas to bring you the news from Ukraine. That's what it costs. When the New York Times has 40 reporters all over the world, Facebook will never do that, nor will Apple, despite the fact that it's a $3 trillion company.
Yes.
And social media is much more an exaggerator of the partisan differences that we all have and share than regular newspapers, because they don't have to be fair and balanced. They can repeat lies without consequence. They can slander, and they are protected by law from libel suits and defamation. So we must do something about social media, which is the future of news. Lord help us in this
I
country.
have a question here.
have one question. Going back, every dictator, first job is to call the press fake news. What is the difference that you see between fake news and some of the stations that are espousing propaganda, and they take a side, and that's no longer journalism. You have show business now. That's what the newspaper has become, show business.
Well, I think that to put this in some perspective, this is not new. I mean, this has been going on for a long time. I was struck by something. I've been reading a book about the fall of Berlin at the end of World War II. And Joseph Goebbels, the great propagandist for the Nazis, was broadcasting right up until, missiles from Russia were blowing Berlin to smithereens, that a secret weapon was going to be coming in and Hitler was going to surprise everybody and wipe them all out, and people believed him, even though they were watching. My point is that people, a willing suspension of disbelief, that's apparently a good part of our DNA. And I think the thing is that you need to be very, very careful about propaganda and fake news, which I think is essentially the same thing. Fake news is good propaganda if it gets by with being perceived as news instead of propaganda. It's like advertisements you see buried in something that looks like a news column, but is really an ad. That's the idea. It's trying to give it credibility by making it look like news. That's what fake news is to me.
I want to go back to something you brought up about the media aggravating the differences and making it worse. About 4 or 5 years ago, I was having dinner with 2 editors who were reading some books. Is this okay? I was having dinner with some editors who were reading books on Trump and laughing about it. And it occurred to me that they really didn't know what was going on, that reporters at all organizations were mostly in large cities who were writing the major news. And there was a book at the time by Adele Hochschild called Strangers in Their Own Land. She had spent 5 years going around this country, talking to workers, talking to blue-collar people in Tennessee, talking to people in Arizona, people who were really fed up and felt that they were being pushed down a hill on their way to respectability. Largely white people who saw themselves being pushed down by blacks, by women, by Muslims, by whatever, and they were angry. And the press, none of it, really picked that up until it was way too late. But it's not true, I don't think that the press may have amplified it, but it was lying there. What the press did, all of it was missed it. And I think in that regard you can fault the press.
This lady back here?
Well, they finally got it, but it took a while.
I don't know if I need a microphone. Do I need one?
It will help if everybody. Where's
Can you hear me? I think the issue about social media is also about attention span, and I don't know how we address that. I mean, when you mentioned there was a 4-page article, I personally glazed over and said I don't know that I would be able to read that, and I don't know how you deal with that as an evolution of humanity. Number 2, I think that this economic model that you described is definitely broken, and I don't know what the solution is, because I think if we talk about wealthy people coming in to support the media, we're still going to have an incredibly biased media. We need a more diversified ownership of media so that we represent everybody's viewpoints. And the third thing I want to say, and I hope it's not too provocative because I think you are all wonderful, but I've read a book recently that talks about journalism and the problem with journalism, and it has to do with what you just said about blue-collar people and feeling disenfranchised. And in fact, the journalistic job many years ago was something that a lot of blue-collar people aspired to do and be, and now journalists are from, no disrespect again, Harvard. And again,
I didn't go to Harvard. I went to Washington and Lee.
And again,
I didn't go to Harvard either.
Neither did I. And so again, there's sort of a bias inherent in the people that are becoming journalists these days and what they're actually talking about. I guess those are all comments.
Let me tell you a quick story, because this issue of, the attention span is not a new one. I was at a newspaper convention when I was at the newspaper at the New York Times of publishers. And the person they had speaking was Tina Brown, who was the editor of Vanity Fair at that time. And she got up in front of this bunch of publishers who looked pretty much like this room looks. And they were not particularly interested in what Tina Brown had to say. And she started off by saying, look, this issue about attention span is phony. This was a time when USA Today was not going to have any breaks for stories inside. She said, people don't care, you know. She said, you guys, it was almost entirely men, of course. She said, you need to edit your newspapers for women. For women. She said, men want to know what happened. Women want to know what really happened.
I think the thing about attention span, I remember when I began writing online, I said, yippee, nobody's going to tell me I have to take a subject that is enormously complicated and just hone it down to like 850 words. I can go on and on and on. And I remember feeling the tap on the shoulder from an editor who said, you've written 1,500 words. I said, yes. And he said, you know, in internet terms, that's 3 or 4 clicks and of the you know, hitting the continue button or the more button at the bottom of your screen. He said, we know that we lose at least half of our readers after the first click. So attention span problems apply across the board.
When they start giving Pulitzers for what can appear on one screen of an iPhone, you'll know that, you know, we have reached the, you know, the limit. How about back over here? We haven't really gotten back to this group.
One more. This is a question, actually. I'm the one that Dale referred to, who wrote a letter to the Post that, was recently published. I was frustrated. I had ideas that weren't being picked up about that while Ukraine was being invaded very quickly. Why would we be using Lend-Lease, which FDR had used so effectively before World War II? Secondly, we're holding a lot of, is that better? Holding funds that belong to Russia. Why not put on notice that those funds are going to be used to rebuild the infrastructure that he's destroying? Among the ideas, I was frustrated not being able to get those before any decision makers. I've worked on the Hill, which took me to Washington, saw how well expressed ideas could be picked up. I was trying to figure out how do you get them in.
Well, if you got it in the Washington Post, you got it in front of those people. There's no question about that. That's the thing. This is a vehicle, the op-ed pages, where people write letters to the editor or guest columns like this one. That's something that is going the way of the dodo bird too, because the op-ed pages go with the newspapers. And increasingly, when I taught at Duke University, and I used to teach kids how to write op-eds because they were citizens, and whether they were going to be journalists or not, I thought they're going to have opinions, and they ought to be able to understand how to write an opinion piece that a local newspaper, not the New York Times, would put in its op-ed pages. And they learned how to do it. And they got their op-eds then, as college students, published. But that is a very important part of the conversation, of the national conversation that we have with each other. When we go to an op-ed page or read columns and we hear what other people have to say about a subject. Again, that's in jeopardy along with the newspapers. Those op-ed pages are going to. Yes, this lady's been.
Frankly, we don't have here college students or young people. There may come a time where newspapers are obsolete. I sent my son, he's 50, subscription for 2 years to the Wall Street Journal. He canceled it. He didn't want to see, he said, what do I need it for? I get my news on TV, I listen, I'm not interested in reading the news. Now, he's very well educated, went to an Ivy League college, he speaks 7 languages, he works in China, has his own opinions. What do you do with a generation of young people who just are not interested?
How old did you say he was?
He's 50.
50. He's not a young person.
Well,
I'm sorry. I mean, but I take your point. I mean, and some people are simply not going to be interested. But it has been the pattern. It has been the pattern that as people grow older, they come to want news more. But I don't know about you.
But I'm saying that, all right, my grandchildren, for example, newspapers are very dear to me. I certainly do not have quite a few subscriptions, and I certainly will keep them. But when it comes to my grandchildren who are 18 and 20, I really don't see it in their future because they're so used to technology. Everything is technology today. And it's not that they don't read books. I have a granddaughter who wrote a book. They do read. But I think it's all going to change. And I think there's going to be new technology that may take the place of newspapers for people to get the news.
I think you're right about the technology. I think the problem is that the technology hitherto has been, giving news that was being reported by newspapers in general. But since that's going to be going away, who's going to do the reporting? And maybe it'll be online, and maybe it'll be supported by nonprofits. I just don't know. But I think that what your grandchildren, if they get news at all, they're getting it from news organizations, but they're reading it online. Yeah. Yes?
Thank you so much for being here today. I love the civility of our conversation.
Good. So do I. Thank you.
Could you elaborate and describe the Pro-Publica model?
Yes. Pro-Publica is a wonderful organization, and I say that because a goddaughter of mine, who is a journalist and lives in Hawaii, in Oahu, just won a very, very prestigious award for reporting about beach erosion and the taking advantage of beach, for destroying beaches in Hawaii. And Pro-Publica sponsored that piece of reporting. Pro-Publica basically is using that model a lot. They're going to a newspaper like the one in Hawaii, in Oahu, and they're teaming with a reporter like my goddaughter and with one of their staff to work together. And then the article, or whatever it is published in the newspaper, online, on their website, and other places. And they are also, because of what they do, they're nonprofit. So they are able to take contributions that are tax deductible. But it's a variation of the nonprofit model.
If I can just say a couple of other words about Pro-Publica, it is not without a political slant. And that's both a good thing that enables them to have been in existence because they were founded by Herb Saunders and his wife. They were given $10 million commitment for 3 years in seed money, and they are known supporters of democratic causes because a lot of investigative reporting is done by reporters who self-identify overwhelmingly as liberal. I think it's one of the things that drives reporters into this business, drives young people into this business. But I think it is a wonderful organization, indispensable. It now has about 75 of its own reporters. It is was headed by a former New York Times person, one of our colleagues, who won Pulitzers. We shared a Pulitzer together. But, for example, when J.J. Abrams, whom you may all know from Star Wars and other things, gave money to finance the political coverage of ProPublica, some of it. That was not disclosed to ProPublica ProPublica readers. And J.J. Abrams was amazingly, left of center. And I think we have to be, that's why you have to read a lot of different things, because you can't assume that we are absolutely even-handed. We're not. We're people, we have our biases, but I think that if ProPublica has a failing, it's only that it doesn't disclose enough about where its money comes from to bring you the news. But without them, there wouldn't be one half of the investigative stories that you read in the papers today. So, bravo ProPublica, but just a little more transparency, and I think that would encourage people to have more confidence in what they're reading.
Alex, could you talk to the audience and to everyone, explain the significance of Times versus Sullivan, the Supreme Court case, and Section 230, and what fight is going on today?
I would be glad to. It's quite important, and this is the lawsuit that Sarah Palin brought, which was a libel suit. The way against the New York Times. The critical piece of law and Supreme Court decision involving this is a case that's called New York Times versus Sullivan, which was back in the early 60s, Bob, am I right about that? Right, 65? It was actually an advertisement in the Birmingham newspaper. And it was about civil rights, and it was taken out by a black group, and they said some things in the ad that were not true. They didn't know they weren't true, but they weren't true. And so in Alabama, the Attorney General sued the New York Times and was trying basically to bring a gigantic libel judgment against the Times there that would have crippled the New York Times everywhere, in other newspapers as well. But the Supreme Court ruled that when it came to public affairs, public officials, public issues, that being 100% accurate was not critical. In other words, they gave some elasticity to making charges or saying things that weren't true. Now that may seem counterintuitive, but frankly, you don't. If you're going to get hammered in a libel suit by saying that so and so's a no good son of a gun, and they can basically say that's not true, I'm not a no good son of a gun, and prove it, then you're completely liable. And our politics depend, and our free speech depends on being able to say things that don't necessarily prove to be true. Now that doesn't mean that there is no basis for these people to be, to sue for libel, but they created a standard. It's called actual malice. Actual malice means that you have to have known that it was not untrue, that it was not true, and published it, or that you had to have published it with reckless disregard for whether it was true or not. Now, if you think about this, I was asking at lunch today, does anyone know who paid for Sarah Palin's lawsuit? I don't know.
Nobody knows.
It's been a very deeply held secret. But I can tell you it's a good thing for both Republicans and Democrats, and for the press and office holders and politicians, that it failed. Because this would affect everybody. It would basically mean that if you were president of the United States and you said something that was untrue, and it was, definitely defamatory about somebody, I think we know where we're going here. I mean, the thing is, that is something that is essential to free speech, and I was amazed, frankly, that it came to trial at all. But it did, and the lower court, it didn't even get to the Supreme Court. They threw it out. You don't want Times v. Sullivan to be overturned, no matter what your politics are.
And Alex, part of the problem with social media is that they are totally protected from libel and defamation suits at the moment because of the Federal Communications Act. a section called 230. And there are increasing demands now in the Congress from both liberals and conservatives, Republicans and Democrats to do something about this, because there is a lot of really fake news, absolute lies, propaganda that appears on these sites routinely without consequence. So there is a movement now. I don't know if it will succeed. I doubt if it will this time. But to repeal that section and make them responsible for what appears on their websites, at least to the Times v. Sullivan standard. That is, if Facebook knows that what it's publishing is defamatory and untrue and continues to carry the story anyway, they can be sued. The New York Times was sued by Sarah Palin, but if she had won, she still wouldn't be able to touch Facebook or any of the social media outlets that carry the story. And that's why it's so important to do something about this, to repeal this provision or reform it.
I think it's important to understand, as I say, Sarah Palin was suing to overturn this, but she was charging that the Times had shown actual malice because they had published something that was not true about her. But the Times recognized the next day that it was not true and immediately recanted it and apologized for it. So it was not reckless disregard for whether it was true. It was simply wrong. And the Times, I think if you read the Times, you know that every day the Times admits that it was wrong about things. It has a corrections column every day without fail, because inevitably the journalists in the world get things wrong. I think, Dale, I don't know, I think that Dale wanted us to go for an hour. This has been wonderful. Thank you all very much.
Too many good questions.